Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be tackling a topic that's been on a lot of people's minds lately, especially after we got that excellent question from Timothy L.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
It's all about the IRS's brand new regulations on digital content.
Yeah, it's complex stuff for sure, but
It's a,
we're going to try to break it down so you can actually understand not only what the regulations say, like the letter of the law, but also what they actually mean,
yeah,
for, businesses and consumers and how it'll affect everyone.
exactly. And believe me, the way these rules categorize things, sometimes it's not at all what you'd expect.
It really isn't.
Uh,
It's a fascinating area where like these traditional tax concepts are kind of meeting this ever-evolving digital landscape that we're in, and
yeah.
it's really interesting to see how they're trying to apply these old rules to, this new world.
Right. And we're not just talking about downloading a song or two here. We're talking about everything from software and ebooks to streaming services and even like in-game purchases, those little microtransactions that have become a huge part of gaming these days.
Right, like Fortnite skins and all that stuff.
Exactly. So if you've ever wondered, how the IRS is wrapping its head around all of this digital stuff,
Hmm.
well, get ready for some aha moments because we're about to unpack it all.
Yeah, and this could have some real implications, for businesses and consumers, so it's definitely worth paying attention to.
Definitely. And before we dive in, I want to remind everyone that this deep dive is brought to you by iFindTaxPro, where tax and legal compliance are made clear and the management of client communication is simple. Check them out at iFindTaxPro.com. It's a platform for professionals and their clients, open to everyone.
Absolutely.
All right, so one of the biggest shifts I've noticed in these regulations is the move away from what they used to call a de minimis rule to a predominant character test.
Yeah, you can think of de minimis as like, too small to bother with, basically.
Oh, okay.
So before, the IRS might just overlook tiny parts of a deal. They don't want to sweat the small stuff. But now, yeah.
They're taking a much more holistic view.
So it's less about, nitpicking every little detail
Exactly.
and more about understanding the big picture, the essence of what's actually being exchanged.
Exactly. Precisely. It's about looking at the big picture and what's the core value of what's being bought or sold.
Gotcha.
For example, let's take a video game with online features.
Sure.
If the main draw of that game, the reason most people buy it is the online play, then the whole game might be treated differently for tax purposes than if it was just a single-player game on a disc.
That's interesting. So how a company markets its product and how customers typically use it, those things actually factor into how it's taxed.
Absolutely. It's all about the substance of the transaction, not just the form. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's where things can get a little tricky because the IRS will consider various factors when determining the predominant character of a digital product or service.
This brings up another interesting distinction the regulations make between streaming and downloading.
Oh, yeah, that's a big
Yep.
one. Is it really that different from the IRS's perspective?
Well, I
I
mean,
mean, you're accessing content either way, right?
right. I mean, from like a user standpoint, that might seem very similar.
Yeah.
But, legally and for tax purposes, there's a really significant difference.
Okay.
When you download something, you're getting a copy of that content,
Right.
which, gives you a certain level of ownership.
Uh-huh.
But when you're streaming something, you're basically just temporarily accessing it.
Gotcha.
You're using the provider's servers to view or listen to the content,
Right.
but you don't actually own a copy of it.
So it's all about ownership versus access.
Exactly.
And this has tax implications.
Oh, yeah. It's a key point for sure.
Oh.
I mean, think about it. If you download an ebook or a movie, you can access it offline
Yeah.
anytime you want.
Like on a plane?
Exactly. And that offline access, that's significant that the IRS takes into consideration.
That little download button suddenly seems a lot more important.
Right. Like it's not just a convenience thing.
Yeah.
It actually has legal implications.
Wow. Well, speaking of rights, you mentioned earlier that copyright law is really central to these new regulations.
Oh, yeah. It's the foundation of how they approach this whole thing.
Can you explain why that is?
Sure. So copyright law basically defines the different types of rights that are associated with copyrighted works.
Okay.
Like the right to make copies, the right to distribute them, the right to create new works based on the original, you know what I mean? Like derivative works.
Yeah.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Sometimes the IRS will look beyond what a contract actually calls something,
Okay.
like whether they call it a license or a sale,
Yeah.
and they'll focus on the actual rights that are being transferred.
So they can override what's written in a contract.
Well, it's not exactly overriding it. It's
Uh,
more like they're more concerned with the substance of the agreement
okay.
than the specific terminology that's used.
Right.
So for example, let's say a software company sells product keys. Now, are those keys more like physical copies of software,
Mm.
or are they just a way to activate a license to use the software?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Right. And that's the kind of question that the IRS is going to grapple with.
They're really trying to take these traditional concepts of ownership
Yes.
and apply them to this intangible digital world where it's not always so clear-cut.
Exactly. It's a tough job for sure.
Yeah, and one of the areas that I know caused a lot of confusion initially was how the IRS was going to treat cloud transactions.
Oh, yeah, it's a whole other can of worms.
Right. I mean, we're all using the cloud these days,
Mm.
whether it's, storing files or using software like Google Docs.
Absolutely.
What is the IRS's perspective on how to handle these transactions?
Well, thankfully, the final regulations actually cleared up a lot of the initial uncertainty.
Okay.
Now, all cloud transactions are classified as services.
Okay, but why does that classification matter? What difference does it make?
It matters for both the provider and the customer. So let's think about using cloud-based software.
Okay.
You're not actually buying a physical product, right?
Right.
You're paying for access to a service that's hosted on the provider's servers.
Okay.
And even if there's a small download component, like maybe you download like a little local app that connects to the cloud service,
Uh-huh.
the overall nature of the transaction is still that you're using a service.
So even if there's a tiny bit of downloading involved,
Yeah.
the cloud aspect is what really matters.
Exactly.
Mm.
And this, it ties back to that predominant character test we were talking about earlier.
Right.
It's all about understanding what is the core value that's being provided.
Okay, I think we've covered a lot of conceptual ground here.
Yeah, definitely.
Let's get into the nitty-gritty now
Let's do it.
of how these rules actually play out in the real world.
Yeah, let's look at some specific scenarios and see how the IRS would actually apply these principles in practice.
Okay.
I think you'll find some of these examples pretty surprising.
All right, so let's jump into some of those real-world examples.
Yeah, let's do it.
Timothy L. specifically asked about software licenses.
Mm-hmm.
I know that's an area a lot of people are curious about.
Yeah, for sure.
So let's say a company sells both perpetual licenses,
Okay.
meaning you can use the software like forever,
Right.
and term licenses, which give you access for a limited time.
Uh-huh.
How does the IRS view those two things differently?
That's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
So the IRS basically wants to figure out, is this transaction more like a sale
Okay.
where you're buying an asset like you buy a house,
Uh-huh.
or is it more like a lease
Okay.
where you're just paying for temporary use?
So a perpetual license sounds a lot like a sale, right?
You would think so, right?
Yeah.
But it's not always that simple.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the IRS looks very closely at the specific rights that are granted in the license agreement.
Okay.
So if the customer has the right to use the software forever to make backup copies
Yeah.
and even to transfer the license to someone else,
Oh, yeah.
then yeah, it's probably going to be treated like a sale.
But what if there are limitations on those rights?
Right. Well, that's where it gets a little more nuanced.
Okay.
So if the license agreement restricts those rights in certain ways,
Yeah.
then it might start to look more like a lease. So, for example, if the company can revoke the license under certain conditions, or if the customer can't transfer it freely,
Okay.
that could tip the scales towards a lease treatment.
But what about term licenses?
Yeah.
Those like short-term subscriptions.
Right.
Those are probably more straightforward.
Yeah. Yeah. Generally speaking, term licenses are treated as leases
Okay.
because the customer's access is limited to a specific period of time.
Right. It's like renting an apartment.
Exactly.
You have the right to use it for a certain time,
Right.
but you don't actually own it.
Precisely.
Makes sense. Now, software companies often bundle things like upgrades and support services with their licenses.
Oh, yeah. All the time.
How does the IRS handle that?
Well, that's where we have to go back to our old friend, the predominant character test.
Okay.
So if the primary benefit the customer is getting is the software itself, then the whole package, including those extra,
Yeah.
might be treated as just one transaction.
So if those support services are just a small part of the deal,
Right.
they don't really change the overall nature of the transaction.
Exactly. But if those services are a significant part of the value proposition,
Okay.
like let's say the customer is paying a lot of money for ongoing technical assistance,
Yeah.
then the IRS might view those services as a separate transaction. They'll try to untangle the different elements
Yeah.
and determine how each one should be treated for tax purposes.
It sounds like there's a lot of judgment involved in applying these rules.
Oh, yeah, there is a lot of judgment involved.
Okay.
And that's why it's super important for businesses to really carefully analyze their digital offerings and document how they're applying these principles. It's also a good idea to talk to tax professionals who are up to date on these regulations.
Good advice.
No.
Now, Timothy L. also had questions about streaming services.
Oh, yeah, streaming, that's huge these days.
Yeah, which is a huge part of the digital economy now.
It is.
We talked earlier about how streaming is about temporary access.
Right.
So is it always treated as a service?
Generally speaking, yes.
Okay.
Streaming services are viewed as providing a service rather than selling a product.
Okay.
The customer is paying for the right to access content,
Yeah.
not to own a copy of it.
But what about those situations where you can download content for offline viewing?
Right.
Like, saving a movie to your phone so you can watch it on a plane.
Yeah.
Does that change things?
It might.
Okay.
Again, that's where the predominant character test comes back into play.
Right.
So if the ability to download is just like a minor perk,
Yeah, okay.
and the primary way customers access the content is through streaming, then it might still be classified as a service.
So a download option doesn't automatically mean it's a sale.
Not necessarily, no.
Okay.
It really depends on the context. How the service is designed and how it's marketed.
This is getting pretty nuanced.
It is. It's very nuanced, and that's why these regulations are so complex.
Yeah.
Every situation really needs to be evaluated carefully.
Okay, so let's move on to another area that Timothy L. asked about: online databases.
Okay.
Things like legal research platforms or subscription-based news websites
Right.
that give you access to a vast library of articles.
Yeah, those are interesting.
How do those fit into this whole framework?
Yeah, they're interesting because they seem to combine elements of both products and services.
Right.
Yeah, you've got the database itself, which is like this collection of information. And then you've got the service of providing access to that database, often with, sophisticated search tools and other features.
So how does the IRS decide which aspect is predominant?
Well, they'll look at a bunch of different factors, like how is the database structured?
Right.
How is the information presented? And, what's the value that's being added by the service provider?
Okay.
So if the main value comes from accessing this curated and organized collection of information with these powerful search capabilities, then it might lean more towards being a service.
So it's not just about the raw data.
Exactly.
It's about the tools and the user experience.
Exactly. It's the whole package.
This is a good example of how these regulations are trying to adapt to the evolving nature of digital content.
It is.
It's not always easy to fit these new business models into neat little categories.
It's really not.
No.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about something that's become a huge part of the gaming world.
Okay.
In-game purchases.
Ah, yes, microtransactions.
Yes, those microtransactions for virtual items, currency, other perks.
Right, all that stuff.
How does the IRS approach those?
Once again, it all comes down to the predominant character of the transaction. It really depends on the nature of the in-game purchase.
Yeah.
And how it relates to the overall game experience.
Can you give us some examples?
Sure. So let's imagine you buy a virtual outfit for your character in a game. Now, if that outfit is purely cosmetic, it doesn't affect the gameplay at all.
Okay.
It might be treated like a sale of a copyrighted article, sort of like buying a digital T-shirt.
Okay.
But if that purchase gives you some kind of functional advantage in the game, like let's say a powerful weapon or a boost to your character's abilities, then it might be seen as a service.
Interesting.
That enhances your gaming experience.
So a virtual sword could be a product.
Potentially, yes.
But a potion that increases your strength could be a service.
Yeah, that's a very simplified way to think about it.
Okay.
But it kind of illustrates the point.
Yeah.
The IRS is looking at the impact of the purchase on the overall game experience.
I can see how this would be a real headache
Oh, yeah.
for businesses trying to comply with all these rules.
Absolutely. It definitely requires a lot of careful analysis
Yeah.
and a really good understanding of how these principles work.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit now
Okay.
and talk about the issue of sourcing income.
Ah, yeah, sourcing income. That's another big one.
We touched on this a little bit earlier,
Yeah,
but it's worth diving into a bit deeper.
absolutely.
This is the question of, where a sale takes place
Right.
for tax purposes when everything's happening online.
Right, because it's not as simple as just looking at where the company is located.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So how do they determine that?
Well, in the past, the IRS often relied on what's called the title passage rule,
Okay.
which basically focused on where the ownership of a product
Yeah.
technically transferred from the seller to the buyer.
Okay.
But in the digital world, that rule can be really hard to apply.
How so?
Well, with digital content,
Yeah.
that transfer of ownership can happen almost instantaneously.
Right.
It's not like shipping a physical product
Yeah.
where you can pinpoint the exact moment and location
Right.
where the title changes hands.
So what do they look at now?
Well, the general rule now
Right.
is that the sale takes place at the billing address
Okay.
of the purchaser.
Right.
However, there's a big exception
Okay.
for situations where the IRS suspects tax avoidance.
Meaning like companies trying to manipulate their billing addresses
Exactly.
to make it look like sales are happening in places with low taxes.
Right, exactly, like trying to shift their income
Yeah.
to a tax haven or something like that.
So trying to game the system is not a good strategy.
Let's just say the IRS is pretty good at catching those kinds of schemes.
Yeah, they probably have some pretty sophisticated algorithms.
Oh, yeah. They've got a lot of data and a lot of smart people working for them.
All right, well, we've covered a lot of ground here.
I have.
From software licenses to streaming services,
Yeah.
from online databases to in-game purchases.
It's a whole new world.
We've seen how these regulations are really starting to reshape the digital landscape.
They really are.
And we've also touched on the complexities of this whole issue of sourcing income in a world where, borders are becoming increasingly blurred.
It's a global economy now.
It is.
And the tax rules are trying to catch up.
It's a lot to take in, I know.
Yeah.
But hopefully you're starting to see the big picture here.
I hope so.
The IRS is trying to adapt
Yes.
these traditional tax principles
Yeah.
to this new digital reality.
Right. And it's an ongoing process for sure.
And as technology continues to evolve,
Right.
we can expect the IRS to keep refining its approach.
Oh, absolutely. They're going to have to stay on top of things.
It definitely feels like we're just at the beginning, like we're on the cusp of a whole new era of tax regulations.
Oh, yeah.
As the digital world just keeps expanding, and it makes you wonder, what are the long-term implications, not just for businesses,
Right.
but for consumers like us too.
Absolutely. I mean, while these regulations are, directly aimed at businesses,
Yeah.
their ripple effects are definitely going to be felt by consumers in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, like what kind of effects are we talking about here? I mean, could this actually impact the prices we pay
Oh, yeah.
for, digital products and services?
Yeah, that's definitely a possibility.
Oh, okay.
As businesses start to adjust to these new rules,
Uh-huh.
they might need to, reevaluate their pricing models.
Okay.
And that could lead to, some price increases in certain cases.
So like we might see our favorite streaming subscriptions going up,
It's possible, yeah.
or software licenses getting a bit more expensive.
It's not out of the question,
Hmm.
but it's not necessarily all bad news.
Okay.
I mean, greater clarity on tax treatment could actually foster a more competitive and innovative digital marketplace.
Okay, how so?
Well, when businesses know the rules of the game,
Yeah.
it kind of levels the playing field, and it encourages them to develop better products and services to attract customers.
So it's like a potential trade-off?
Yeah.
Like maybe some price increases in the short term,
Possibly.
but potentially better offerings down the line.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. It's still early days, though,
Yeah.
The full impact of these regulations is going to take a while to really play out. But one thing's for sure, the digital economy is here to stay.
Yeah, it's not going anywhere.
And the IRS is definitely trying to keep up.
They're trying to figure it out.
They are.
All right, well, we've covered a lot of complex territory today.
We have.
But if there's one key takeaway I want our listeners to walk away with,
Yeah.
it's that the IRS is really shifting its focus away from, just the technicalities of digital transactions
Right.
and moving towards this more holistic approach.
Exactly. It's less about parsing contract language or
Yeah.
dissecting the mechanics of downloads and uploads, and more about understanding the essence of what the transaction is.
Yeah, like what's really being exchanged?
Yeah, exactly.
What value is being provided?
Huh.
And where is that value being created and enjoyed?
Those are the big questions.
Yeah, so it's a more contextualized view,
You know?
taking into account the bigger picture.
Precisely. And it really reflects a recognition,
Yeah.
that the digital world just operates differently
Yes.
than the traditional brick and mortar world.
Yeah.
And the tax rules have to reflect that reality.
It's a whole new ball game.
It is.
All right. Well, it's been a fascinating deep dive.
It has.
A huge thanks to Timothy L. for suggesting this topic.
Yeah. Great question, Timothy.
It's clearly something that's on a lot of people's minds.
Yeah.
And for those of you who have questions about this or any other tax-related topic, please send them our way.
We love to hear from you.
We love exploring new territory.
Absolutely.
And speaking of expert guidance,
Yes.
don't forget to check out iFindTaxPro at iFindTaxPro.com.
Yeah, they're a great resource.
They are.
For anyone who's, trying to navigate the complexities of tax and legal compliance,
Absolutely.
it can be tough out there.
It can be. And before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a question to ponder.
Okay, hit me.
We've seen how the IRS is currently approaching digital content, right?
Right.
But as we all know, technology is constantly evolving at a rapid pace.
Oh, yeah, always changing.
So do you think these regulations will be able to keep up?
That's a good question.
Yeah, what might the future hold for digital taxes?
Yeah, it's hard to say for sure, but it's definitely something to think about.
It is, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, let us know what you think.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for today.
Well, that went by fast.
It did. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the IRS's new digital content regulations.
Yeah, it's been fun.
It has been. We hope you found it informative and engaging.
And hopefully not too confusing.
Hopefully we made it at least a little bit clear.
Fingers crossed.
And until next time, happy taxing everyone.
See you later.